Chuckwagon MTG is sponsored by BC Comics and Games. Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us for another great deck tech here on Chuckwagon MTG. Today we bring you Golem Brigade, an Esper standard deck that will have your opponent staring down a Golem army. This deck is designed to stall out your opponent's early game, then proceed to dominate once the mid-game kicks off. First, let's go over the cards that make up this deck. For creatures, we have 2 copies of Aven Windguide, a 2/3 bird warrior for 2 generic, 1 white and 1 blue mana. It has flying and vigilance. Creature tokens you control have flying and vigilance as well. It also has an embalm cost of 4 generic, 1 white, and 1 blue mana. Next, we have 3 copies of Golden Guardian, a 4/4 artifact creature golem for 4 generic mana that has Defender and pay 2 generic mana. Golden Guardian fights another target creature you control. When Golden Guardian dies this turn, return it to the battlefield transformed under your control. When it transforms into Goldforge Garrison, a land that can tap to add 2 mana of any 1 color to your mana pool, or you can pay 4 and tap it, create a 4/4 colorless Golem artifact creature token. Then we have 4 copies of Dire Fleet Poisoner, a 2/2 human pirate for 1 generic and 1 black mana that has Flash, Death Touch, and when Dire Fleet Poisoner enters the battlefield, target attacking pirate you control gets +1/+1 and gains Death Touch until end of turn. And lastly, we have 4 copies of Gifted Aetherborn, a 2/3 Aetherborn vampire for 2 black mana that has Death Touch and Lifelink. Now, these last 2 creatures are the ones we want to see early, mainly because of their Death Touch abilities. These will help slow down our opponent's early game and help us get to the point of the game where our deck starts to really take off. We also have some instants to help us through the early game as well. We have 3 copies of Fatal Push, an instant for 1 black mana that destroys target creature if it has converted mana cost of 2 or less. It also has Revolt of destroy that creature if it has converted mana cost of 4 or less instead if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn. We also have 3 copies of Negate, an instant for 1 generic and 1 blue mana that says counter target non-creature spell. And we also have 3 copies of Opt, an instant for 1 blue mana that says scry 1 and then you get to draw a card. Lastly, we have 2 copies of Release to the Wind, an instant spell for 2 generic and 1 blue mana. Exile target non-land permanent. For as long as that card remains exiled, its owner may cast it without paying its mana cost. We'll go over the importance of that card here in a minute. We also have 2 different sorceries in this deck. First, we have 3 copies of Chart a Course, a sorcery for 1 generic and 1 blue mana that says draw 2 cards, then discard a card unless you attacked with a creature this turn. And we also have 2 copies of Hour of Revelation, a sorcery for 3 generic mana and 3 white mana. Hour of Revelation costs 3 generic mana less to cast if there are 10 or more non-land permanents on the battlefield. And it says destroy all non-land permanents. Next up is our enchantments. We have 3 copies of Anointed Procession, an enchantment for 3 generic and 1 white mana. If an effect would create 1 or more tokens under your control, it creates twice that many of those tokens instead. Then we have 3 copies of Profane Procession, a legendary enchantment for 1 generic, 1 white, and 1 black mana that has pay 3 generic, 1 white, and 1 black mana, exile target creature. Then, if there are 3 or more cards exiled with Profane Procession, transform it. Then it transforms into Tomb of the Dusk Rose, a legendary land that you can tap to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, or you can pay 2 generic, 1 white, and 1 black mana, tap it, put a creature card exiled with this permanent onto the battlefield under your control. And then we have 2 copies of Search for Azcanta, a legendary enchantment for 1 generic and 1 blue mana. At the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. You may put that card into your graveyard. Then, if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you may transform Search for Azcanta. It transforms into Azcanta, the Sunken Ruin, a legendary land that can tap to add 1 blue mana to your mana pool, or you can pay 2 generic and 1 blue mana, tap it, Look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a non-creature, non-land from among them and put it into your hand. The rest go on the bottom of your library in any order. For our land base, we're running 2 copies of Field of Ruin. It can tap to add 1 generic mana to your mana pool, or you can pay 2, tap it and sacrifice it, destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls. Each player searches his or her library for a basic land card, puts it onto the battlefield, then shuffles his or her library. We also have 4 copies each of Drowned Catacombs and Glacial Fortress, as well as having 4 islands, 5 plains, and 4 swamps. Now, the idea is that once we make it to the mid-game, we want to have as many of our flip lands flipped over to the land side as possible. Now, while they'll all aid us on their land side, the Golden Guardian is the centerpiece for the deck and the one we want flipped the most. This is the second purpose of all the Death Touch creatures, aside from just slowing down our opponent's early game. Once the Death Touch creatures are out, we can pay the 2 generic mana on Golden Guardian and make them fight, then Golden Guardian flips. Once Golden Guardian has flipped into Goldforge Garrison, and Profane Procession has flipped into Tomb of the Dusk Rose, we can play Hour of Revelation. This is where Release to the Wind comes into play. Just exile any permanent that we don't want to be swept up by Hour of Revelation, and then we get to recast it. Now that our Goldforge Garrison is online, we can play our Anointed Procession, so we can start forming our Golem Brigade that will have flying and vigilance once we play our Aven Wind Guide. Our sideboard consists of 2 copies of Fragmentize, a sorcery for 1 white mana, destroy target artifact or enchantment with converted mana cost of 4 or less. This is essentially just for any artifact decks we happen to come across or anything with heavy enchantments. Then we have 2 copies of Fumigate, a sorcery for 3 generic and 2 white mana. Destroy all creatures. You gain 1 life for each creature destroyed this way. This is to slow down anyone who tries to overrun us early. Then we have 2 copies of Gideon's Intervention, an enchantment for 2 generic and 2 white mana. As Gideon's Intervention enters the battlefield, choose a card name. Your opponents can't cast spells with the chosen name, and prevent all damage that would be dealt to you and permanents you control by sources with the chosen name. This is essentially for any threat that we have no direct way to deal with, and is especially good against Approach of the Second Sun and God Pharaoh's Gift decks. We have 3 copies of Restoration Specialist, a 2/1 Dwarf Artificer that costs 1 generic and 1 white mana, and you can pay 1 white mana, sacrifice Restoration Specialist, return up to 1 target artifact card and up to 1 target enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. This is just in case you find yourself wishing you could get back your Golden Guardian and Anointed Procession from the graveyard. Then we have 2 copies of Settle the Wreckage, an instant for 2 generic and 2 white mana. Exile all attacking creature target player controls. That player may search his or her library for that many basic land cards, put those cards onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle his or her library. This is going to be there for in case we happen to run into any decks running Indestructible or Hexproof. We also have 2 copies of Slaughter the Strong, a sorcery for 1 generic and 2 white mana. Each player chooses any number of creatures he or she controls with total power 4 or less, then sacrifices all other creatures he or she controls. This is for decks that happen to run bigger Indestructible and Hexproof creatures. And lastly, we have 2 copies of the Scarab God, a 5/5 legendary god for 3 generic, 1 blue, and 1 black mana. At the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses X life and you scry X, where X is the number of zombies you control. It also has pay 2 generic, 1 blue, and 1 black mana, exile target creature card from a graveyard. Create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 4/4 black zombie. It also has, when the Scarab God dies, return it to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. This will help us out if we happen to need a few more tokens coming out of the field, or if we run into any kill spell heavy decks. Well, that about does it for our deck tech of Golem Brigade. Not only is this deck list fun, but its level of early game control and mid-game breakout can quickly put the odds in your favor and should do well at lower level events. If you happen to play this deck at an event or even at your kitchen table, leave us a comment below and let us know how you did. And even if you didn't play it and just have some thoughts on it, we'd love to hear them as well. I want to thank you all very much for checking this deck tech out. If you like what you saw here today, click that like button, hit subscribe, and share this with your friends, your family, your loved ones, and your pets. Everyone could use a little more magic in their lives. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and as always, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, Chuckwagon MTG. Now, if you could do us a huge favor and check out this brief message about our sponsor. Chuckwagon MTG is sponsored by BC Comics and Games. They have 3 different locations, and they run Magic events every Monday through Saturday, and their Friday Night Magic consists of Standard, Modern, and Legacy every week. This is why I've personally made BC Comics and Games my home gaming store.